Welcome back, everybody. For today's video, as Kari Nakamura likes to say, we are going to be taking a look at 3 of my games that I've been playing in the past. Now, you might be wondering, why did I decide to suddenly start going back to YouTubing after taking a 4-year-long break? Well, the answer is, I'm just not going to say it. I'll tell you at the end of this video. So stay till the end, and you might hear a little treat about why I decided to go back to YouTubing. So I'm going to be showing you 3 of my games that were all played in the Friday Night Face-Off last week on July 11th, 2025. The Holiday Inn and Suites in Exit 11 of Alpharetta, Georgia. So without further ado, let's get into it. My opponent is Sanjeev Anand, a soon-to-be tournament director, and very nice guy. So I was playing with the white piece in the first game, and I started with 1 e4. He responds with c5. We get a classic Sicilian with e6, striking the center with d4, take, and he goes a6. The idea of a6 is to stop knight b5 in the future. Knight c3, queen c7, a nice line in this variation. Whenever you put the pawn on e6, you usually tend to put the queen on c7, and then you try to strike with some bishop b4 ideas. So to prevent that, I just played a3. Don't want to get into anything too fancy with this bishop b4. I usually don't like going into this type of stuff. So a3, knight c6, all standard stuff, bishop b3, knight f6, bishop b2. Notice how we're slowly developing our pieces, putting our kings behind the pawns. And then here, I go for something a little bit unusual. I don't think the computer likes my choice here. Here I play king h1. My idea with king h1 is to strike with f4 in the future, and the main reason why I decided to play king h1 was because I didn't want something with bishop c5. Bishop c5 coming in the way, and then just eventually just putting pressure on my king. So I decided, okay, let's just put the king in the corner and just play king h1. So now my opponent plays rook d8. Rook d8 I did not like. I did not see why the rook was coming behind this pawn, and I didn't really expect him to think that he was going to be able to somehow open up this file like this. Because with my next move, f4, I'm actually saying that if you play d5, if you play d5, I am not going to take your pawn and give this rook mobility. Instead, I'm just going to push e5, lock your rook behind it, and also kick your knight away. Here, taking on d5 once again would be good. Why? Think about it. We're activating the rook. We don't want to be activating the rook, right? We want to keep the rook behind pawns, where the rook tends to usually be less mobile. Here, if we play e takes, this is not looking very pretty for us, right? Pressure on the center, this rook is nice and active, and we have just helped him develop. So instead, I go for e5, which is the better move, closing the center and making sure that my opponent doesn't get wrapped in rook. As long as his d pawn doesn't move, this rook behind the queen is never a threat for me. But here, my opponent needs to play knight e4. Why? Because if I take on e4, obviously this is not good, because the rook is coming behind the pawn, and the rook is coming on the d file, and the d file is not open because there's no more pawns on the file. But here my opponent opts for something a little bit not the best, but probably acceptable, which is knight d7. Knight to d7 retreats the knight, and then here I definitely felt like I was better, because his pieces are very sleepy, my pieces are nice and active, I have this rook coming here, my queen is doing an okay job here, let's give it an orange, and we still have this rook to develop, but we'll figure that out as the game goes on. So, here I continue with rook f3, which is part of my plan. My plan with f4 is obviously to bring the rook in, and then start attacking this weak king side. As you can see, after this knight moved away, this king lost a defender of its position, wasn't it? So, instead, we decided that we were going to attack this weak king side because this knight has now moved away. So now, we continue. My opponent plays knight takes d4. Knight takes d4 was probably not the best move, but it was good enough to get the knight out of the center. Bishop takes, bishop c5. My opponent is trying to trade all the pieces down because he realizes that he is clearly underdeveloped. So whenever you are underdeveloped, you would want to try to trade as many pieces as you can to get rid of any threats against your king. So obviously, I am not going to waste time taking on c5. I'm just going to go continue with my plan with h3. And then now my opponent plays bishop takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Getting rid of my bishop pair and getting rid of one of these inactive pieces. Although the bishop might have been a little bit stronger on the e7 square. I think I want the blue arrow on the board. How about blue arrow? Because I'm not. Okay, let's continue. e5. Queen to c5. An interesting shot. Attempting to trade queens, because now if I were to take on c5, this knight is suddenly becoming so much more active, and this bishop might suddenly find a way to get into the game. So obviously we are not going to take on c5. Instead, we're going to play queen d3. Queen d3 is a nice shot with the h7 pawn. So now my opponent has to defend an imminent mate. Knight f8 is one of many options, but is best according to the computer. Knight e4 is an interesting move. Knight e4, we're bringing our knight to the middle of the board, we're attacking the queen, and obviously our opponent cannot take because their rook would be hanging on b8. So now, the whole point of knight e4, as we now see, queen e7. Queen e7 was probably not the best way to defend it, because now queen e7, we have this move knight to d6. Knight to d6 is just a nice shot, because now this knight is just a monster in the black's position. Just a monster. Bishop b7. Here I put bishop h5. I was trying to strike at f7 and hoping to provoke a g6 weakness. But here I just played bishop e8, which was probably not the best option, because now look at your pieces, they're just all kind of sleeping over here. And none of your pieces have moved beyond your own third rank. One was probably not the best idea, but I felt like it had good intentions, as we were going to bring in the rook to e3 and g3. Although the computer says queen d4 was best, and queen d4, I guess the idea is that after queen d4, we now have shots at f5, considering the fact that our pawn is safe and guarded. So anyways, g6 is, I got what I wanted. I finally provoked g6. Bishop g4. I decided to wait and see what I could do, and hoping for some f5 things, and then I thought I might get a sack in somewhere, even though it would never be realistic because the knight could just come to g6. And here my opponent overextends with the move f5. f5 is not the way to go here. Now there are just suddenly so many holes in your position. Your king is becoming more and more exposed, and there are suddenly so many more targets in your position. Bishop f3, bishop c6, rook g1. Rook g1, although it had good intentions, rook g1 was not better than g4 immediately. The whole idea with rook g1 was that I would get g4 in the future. But g4 immediately was actually better because, well, what's he going to do about it? Take, he's striking the center, we're coming back with our bishop, and we're going to be completely fine. And then, well, what else could you do? Now, you would have to sack the rook, but then this position is just good for me. Like, it's just plainly good for me. And, yeah, This is just so good. Our bishop is nicely keeping an eye on e6. Our rook is now on e5, preventing an e5 push. We're gonna triple up file, and this pawn will soon become Black's worst nightmare. We will be able to clean exchange, and we will hopefully go on to win the game. So that was what I should have played, but here instead I decided to opt for rook g1, which would better prepare g4, and also with the hopes of the rook just coming behind the pawn and hopefully striking the king in the future. Well, now the problem is that our opponent can just sack the rook here. When it sacks the rook, although we are now up in exchange, our opponent now has some counterplay. The steps coming at f4, and we would have to play something like g3 or queen d4. And although we are better, it would have been nicer to have our rook on the e file instead of just wasting a move at the time and losing tempo. So now our opponent plays queen c7. Queen c7 is an inaccuracy, as you can see by the computer analysis, because our opponent just should have went for the rook sack, but now he's prolonging it, and now I had this opportunity to strike with g4. So strike with g4, take, bishop takes, and now my opponent is forced to more or less sack the rook, otherwise devastation is coming on his king side. Rook is sacked, queen takes back, and now I played this only move, queen d4. Queen d4 is required to stop any d4 push in the future, and that's all on the stack. e1 and bishop d7. Bishop d7 is deemed an inaccuracy by the computer because you're bringing your pieces back, and now I have more shots in the center with c4. Here I unfortunately missed the move c4, and I play king g1. King g1 is not the best because we're just wasting time. Obviously nothing is going to come out of this diagonal just as the bishop is moved, so king g1 just is a clear waste of time, and it was not a good move. h5. My opponent decided to strike with h5. This creates more holes in the position and probably not a good move. h3, knight h7, c4, and knight f6. After knight f6, I felt like my position was definitely better, but after the knight came here, I was a little disappointed that the knight would now have shots at penetrating and defending the position. Here I play this move rook e5. Rook e5 is a very common idea in these types of positions where you have a backward pawn. A backward pawn being any pawn that is on a backward pawn is a pawn that cannot be supported by any pawns next to it. As you can see, this pawn is overextended and is on a semi-open file. And when a backward pawn's on a semi-open file, it is usually a weakness. So rook e5 is preventing this pawn from ever coming forward in the future, and this rook just now has more mobility on this fifth rank. Queen c6, cd5, and here we have knight b5. Knight b5 is further increasing advantage because now drops towards this pawn, and the knight on b5 is not a huge target, and we now have the d file open for ourselves. Bishop d2 was a good move because we are going to be striking it and returning to this tactically weak pawn. Queen b5, and here I rush. I should not be going for this knight immediately. This knight is actually a huge weakness, and I should not be eliminating it on the spot. But it's not too bad of a move, and I felt like the knight would be a huge pain while I was actually playing the game. So then here I just went straight for the removal. I took, and now here I missed my golden shot. Here I need to play rook e8, bishop e8, and here I need to play this crazy move f5. Why? After you take, look at what's happened here. Look at these weaknesses. Look at this king. Look at all these penetration squares over here. If I can bring my queen and my rook into these penetration squares, imagine what would happen to the king. Whatever. I missed it and I played the move King F2. King F2 drops my advantage by almost 3 points, as you can see by the computer differences. And it is because obviously I missed Rook E8 and King F2 was just not the move. And here was my last chance to actually keep my advantage. I needed to play Queen E5, staying on this open file and just continuing to put pressure along this file. Here I played Fe5, thinking about creating a passer here, but obviously my opponent can just come and blockade it with their king or with their bishop, king with their king and their bishop. But here my opponent plays bishop f5, bishop e6 would have been better, and here is my last chance. I need to play e6. Why? Same idea as before. I need to open up lights. But I miss it and I play rook e3. Rook e3, this is my last chance, and here my opponent can just play king e6 and they're just completely fine. But my opponent here decides to play queen c4. Queen c4 offers a trade of queens and goes into an endgame. Here, both of us had around 2 or 3 minutes left, and we were just trying to play off the clock, and we were just trying to play as fast as we could. So, without much thinking, I just accept the queen trade, and we go into this endgame with a bishop versus a rook, where I am down a pawn, but my one pawn that I have in this position that can actually move is going to be blockaded by 2 pieces. So, here, I miss my last shot. E6 is probably a better move. Why? Because after king f3, if my opponent can play king e6, where is my rook going to penetrate? If the whole point of my rook in the endgame should be that the rook has a bunch of open lines and the rook should be aiming to penetrate and to scoop up these pawns from behind, and then we would get our own pawns rolling down the board. But we miss it and we play king f3. We need to play rook c3. Why? With b5, we have this move b3, and we are now suddenly infiltrating into the position. e6 and king f4. Here I was just persistent on defending this pawn, but then as you can see, we just don't get, we can't make any progress here. This bishop is cleverly guarding this one square I need for penetration, and the c pawn is always a huge problem. So here we play here my opponent plays b5, defending the last weakness in the position that's on c4, and then here h4. I just play h4, making sure that there aren't any g5 pushes, and then here my opponent offers me a draw. Now, I did not accept the draw in this exact position because my opponent was very low on time. However, both of us had stopped notating, and therefore this is not the end of the game. But what happened at the end of the game was I eventually traded off this b pawn. like this. My opponent got a c pawn passer, and then the king and bishop were enough to draw the game. So, an unfortunate miss there with all these chances to save the game. An unfortunate miss, but we just gotta learn to accept it. Okay, our next game was against multimillionaire, entrepreneur, and the guy who runs his own talk show, Mr. James Altucher. James Altucher is rated 2034, and he is a national master. And I'm sitting down and playing against him with the black pieces. So, without further ado, let's get into the game. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, and now we are in the standard queen's gonna decline. Here James Altucher drops off the pawn, then he goes bishop d5, bishop e7, e3, castles, and here my opponent plays bishop d3. Bishop d3 is a key move, attacking the h7 pawn in the future, c6, and knight ge2, bishop e6, and knight bb7, and here we have f3. James Altucher has actually played this against me once already, but how the game went here is was that I played Rook E8, I played Knight F8, and then I actually ended up getting a huge spaces advantage. I had 3 pieces on the back rank, and I eventually got destroyed. So in this game, I try to go for something different, where I open up the position with the move C5. C5 is probably not Hidden's top pick, but my goal is just to open up the center and make sure that that nightmare that's happened to me before does not happen ever again. So here we play C5, Bishop H4, and Rook C8. Rook C8 is just putting pressure on this file. 2, A6, A4, Bishop D6, and King H1. King H1, obviously the idea is in the future, we can play H4 and G4, which is what he did to me in the last game. A6, and here my opponent plays A5, fixing my pawn on B7, because there aren't really many pushes in the future as A6 will be hanging. Bishop C7, I'm just waiting, and I'm also attacking this A pawn because now it is a weakness because my opponent has decided to commit it to A5, and my opponent does not have B4 because I can just snap off the pawn. Queen A4 is the only move that defends the pawn. CD4, ED4, and Knight H5. Now I see that my opponent's pieces are all on the queen side, and then I start trying to come for something on the king side. B4, Queen G4, Queen D5, Queen D1, and Bishop D6. Bishop D6 is coming for these pawns. B5 and Bishop B4. Bishop B4 was not a very good move because Bishop B4 just simply wastes time. I should be snapping off this pawn and preventing any threats on the A6 pawn in the future. Bishop B1 and Knight F4. Instead of Bishop B4 here, I actually should have thought something about Knight F4, but instead I go for Knight F4 here and I just miscalculate. Here my idea was that my opponent could take here, that after my opponent took here, I was expecting this, but then I was hoping that at the end of this line we would have had Queen D4. I was actually not expecting. I had actually completely overlooked the fact that Knight D5 was an option, but my opponent did not go for this line. This line would have probably not been too bad for me, but this line after Knight F4, Queen F4 is the other line. But here I don't play Queen F4. Here I have to play Bishop C3. Why don't I play Queen F4? Because I don't want to allow that previous line. So I play Bishop C3, snapping off the knight. But here I miss this in-between move, Knight to E6. Knight to E6, F6, Bishop C3, Rook C3, and now he snaps off this pawn. Here, I guess I just get a little desperate, and then I just realize that if I don't win this game, it would not be looking very good for my rating. So I play the move Queen E3. Queen E3 is just a desperate shot, and it just completely blunders after A takes B7. But instead, my opponent plays Bishop B5, which is the best response. Tempo on the knight, and with threats of snapping off the knight and the pawn at the same time. Rook C7, Rook E1, Queen C3, and here AB7. AB7 was probably not the best move. Computer says Queen C1 is probably better, forcing a queen trade because we cannot move the queen away safely without the rook hanging. Forcing the queen trade would have probably been better there. But here Rook B7, and here Bishop B7, Rook B7, and now we get into this endgame where we're a pawn down. My opponent has an A pawn passer, but my rooks are probably going to be very active in stopping the pawn. A6, Queen C6, Queen E2, Rook E7, defending this pawn. A7. A7 is a huge mistake because I think my opponent was thinking that after Rook A8 they would have Queen A6 and they would be completely fine here. But the problem is that after you take take, and then rook a7, this endgame is actually just a draw. But in this game, I realized that after queen a6, I was probably better. So instead, I decided to go for something fancy, and I played queen c3. Queen c3 is still equal, but I don't want to trade off queen, and I still want to keep my chances. Because I was actually hoping for some tricks along the back rank. And then here, we actually end up getting what we wanted, because after queen a5, I played queen c2. Queen c2 was not good because I just needed to trade off, because I just needed to take this pawn. But I don't take the pawn. I guess we were just really low on time here. I just played queen c2. Then here, my opponent makes a huge mistake. Queen b6 does not work, because I guess they were threatening rook b8, but they should have just realized after rook e8 I was completely fine. Here I played king h7. King h7 is not good, because I'm just wasting my time here. I should have just came back, and then we were picking up the pawn to maybe a draw. But then here my opponent made a fatal mistake. Rook ec1. Because now he missed that I could sacrifice the rook. And then our rooks would be connected, and the problem is that my opponent cannot take my rook, because their rook would be hanging and they would be getting mated. So rook a7, queen b1, and then here I put queen g6. I decided that if you want to trade queens, we'll trade on my terms, with now my king getting active on g6. Rook b1, and then here I play rook a4, attacking the pawn. My other rook comes into the party, and then eventually my opponent smothers himself, and he gets moved. A nice game from James Altucher, but eventually I do get lucky and I come out on top. And as of this game, my rating had unofficially crossed 2,000. So at this point, I was contemplating whether or not to withdraw, but since it was a quad tournament, I did not want to, and I decided to play my last game against the very talented FIDE master, Andrew Gio. I was unfortunately playing with the black pieces, and then he opens with the move knight f3. Knight f3, he had played against me before. I played d5 last time I played him, and here I decided to go for knight c6. Knight c6 is not the type of move that you would regularly see. I had seen this in one of the games during the Castle Chess Grand Prix, but I did not know any theory. I guess I just decided that I was going to wing it. d4, d5, c4, e6, e3, knight f3. Here we just get into a regular queen's gambit decline position, but with this knight ugly on c6. But here bishop e3, and we actually get a chance here, because here I have this move knight b4, with a tempo on the bishop, because you don't want to trade up the bishop in the queen's pawn opening. I get knight b4, and then I can put c5 and retreat my knight back, which is exactly what happens. Here I got my knight back, and then we're completely fine. Okay, sorry about that. So here we have knight c6. Knight c6, we retreat back, and we are in a completely okay position. Knight c6, we have cd5, bishop c5, b4, and bishop d6. Bishop d6, we retreat our bishop back, and now we are threatening bishop that's on the h2 pawn, and our pieces are just better developed than Andrew's pieces. 5, ed5, bishop d2, castles, rook e8. Here we just get castling, and our rooks are along the open files. Rook e8, knight d2, knight e5, take, bishop takes, rook takes. And here we get into an okay position where we have a rook nicely developed, but my opponent can just come back and kick it, and then get a nice outpost on b4. Knight e4, and after knight e4, I felt pretty happy with what I'd gotten, because I got this now semi-open e-file, and I also got my nice bishop is starting to snipe in the future. My queen is coming to g5, and although my opponent's bishop is clearly better, I felt like I still had some pretty practical chances. Knight e4, rook c1, and here I played queen g5. I decided, okay, Andrew, if we're gonna play, let's try to have a nice attacking game. Queen g5, bishop f3, bishop d7, and here my opponent, obviously noticing that the 7th rank is now open for him, plays rook c7. And here I came up with this, I felt pretty proud of myself with this idea of rook e7, although it turned out to actually be a mistake. The idea of rook e7 is that if you took this pawn, which seems pretty natural as it's just hanging, I have this move bishop a4, attacking the queen, and if you were to take the bishop, I would take your rook, and I would be up in exchange for a bishop and a pawn. And although this is still pretty much equal, I felt like this would be better than any alternative. But I actually missed that after rook e7, my opponent would have queen c1 with the same threat. But here my opponent plays queen d3, not defeating the threat, and then here I play rook d8. Rook fc1 is simply developing behind this rook and protecting the rook. He'll play h6, creating a luff or a breathing room for my king to prevent backhand checkmate. Knight e2. The idea of knight e2 was actually very subtle, and I didn't realize it until I had played a6, and my rook is just not having a good day defending this bishop. a6 is just a terrible blunder. My idea was to try to play bishop b5 in the future, but this is just a terrible blunder because my opponent can play rook d7, sacrificing the rook, because after you take back, you can just take this knight, and you now have 2 pieces for my lowly rook. So here after rook d7, I played knight f2, which was pretty much my only option to stay in the game. Knight f2, queen d5, rook d7, queen d7, and queen e3. Here, I was hoping that I would have a last resort. I would hopefully have some chances with the smothered mate, but obviously Andrew, being the strong player that he is, obviously sees that and plays queen d4. And I absolutely have no chances here. I take on a3 after I play knight h3. First I play knight h3, just a final check. Ask the king to come to f1, king f1, and then queen a3. My opponent cannot take because their bishop would be hanging. So Andrew displays queen c3 here, forcing a trade of queens, because if I did not trade queens here, my knight would just be hanging if I took the time to move my queen away. I have to trade, and now my knight comes back to g5, and now I'm just simply a piece down for 2 pawns. Here I felt like I would still be lucky enough to maybe have a chance here. So here bishop d5, b6, rook d8, and here I play the move knight h7. This simply allowing rook c7 penetration, and this f pawn is going to be completely fried. I cannot play rook f8 because there is knight g6. So here I play g5, hoping for some counter shots, but obviously this game is completely over. Knight e6, rook b8, take. Here I am just down a pawn. Here I'm up a pawn for a bishop, but after all the following exchanges, I played this position out hoping that it would be a draw, but this is clearly not a draw because this one pawn is sufficient enough for my opponent to simply come and scoop up this pawn, and this pawn would be enough to win the game. However, if these pawns were say not on the board, this position would actually be a theoretical draw, although it was very hard to defend. Rook a5, king g7, and then here I stopped notating. I just kept playing the game out. One more thing I just gotta point out: after a5, ba5, I was actually hoping that here I would have rook f8, but I had actually missed rook f5. By that time, I'd just been getting a really bad headache, and I just played terribly. And this is what the internet expects the game would have lasted at, but this game is just completely over. My opponent's just up a piece. He's just gonna come scoop up this pawn, and this game would be completely lost. Well, that's it for the 3 games that we would be recording today. My announcement would be I finally crossed 2,000 in USCF, and therefore I decided to come back to YouTubing, as I had actually made a secret deal to myself that if I were to cross 2,000, I would go back to chess YouTubing. So after this game, my rating was 2001, which was directly off. I can show it over here. After this game, my rating was 2001. Big shout out to Andrew Jiang for winning my quad at a 3 out of 3 perfect score. And my rating is 2001, and it was a good tournament overall. Missed a few chances, but at the end we got the job done and we got to 2,000. So I'm going to start recording a video about every week. So if you want to catch some of that, stay tuned to the end. Thank you for staying tuned to the end. Thank you so much for the support, and I will see you in my next video. Please make sure to like and subscribe to get updates on my future videos. Please make sure you like and subscribe. Once again, thank you for staying to the end, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!